is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber this afternoon. Your presence underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Czechia, Ireland, Italy, Germany, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Turkey, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. And in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary-General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, and I thank her. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm pleased to read a statement today on behalf of Secretary-General António Guterres, who unfortunately could not make the session. 1,000 days have passed since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in brazen violation of the UN Charter and international law. 1,000 days of widespread death, destruction, and despair that continue unabated for millions of Ukrainians. 1,000 days in, this war rages on undiminished. Deadly battles engulf more and more of eastern and southern Ukraine. Entire cities, villages, and towns have been reduced to rubble. Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Vovchansk, and Volodar have been virtually wiped off the map. Since February 2022, at least 12,164 civilians have been killed, including over 600 children. At least 26,871 others have been injured. And these are just the confirmed numbers. The actual death toll is likely much higher. The past several months have seen a significant increase in civilian casualties. October and November saw some of the most intense and large-scale missile and drone attacks of the war. Over the weekend, Russia launched one of its largest combined strikes, reportedly involving 120 missiles and 90 drones, and targeting energy infrastructure in all Ukrainian regions, which resulted in severe damage and casualties. Last night, there were also media reports that Ukrainian forces would be given authorization to use long-range weapons supplied by partners for strikes within Russia. I want to be clear. All parties must ensure the safety and protection of civilians, regardless of their location. Across Ukraine, residential areas have increasingly come under attack. The people of Kiev are again being forced to take shelter from nightly drone and missile barrages. Critical civilian and energy infrastructure in Ukraine are systematically targeted and decimated, depriving many Ukrainians of access to basic needs. At least 580 medical facilities have been damaged or destroyed. with many first responders and medical personnel killed and injured. And at least 1,358 educational facilities have been damaged or destroyed. Ukraine has now become one of the world's most heavily mined places, with almost 1/4 of its territory contaminated with mines, an area 4 times the size of Switzerland. The environmental degradation caused by the war, including from the destruction of critical infrastructure, such as the Kakhovka Dam, has resulted in long-term consequences for local ecosystems as well as Ukraine's agriculture. Millions of traumatized people are dependent on life-saving humanitarian aid. Nearly 4 million remain internally displaced, and more than 6.8 million have fled the country. And in every conflict, women are disproportionately impacted by the economic and social consequences of the war. An entire generation of children is being deprived of proper education as attacks have driven schools online or underground in shelters. Meanwhile, human rights continue to be systematically violated. Mr. President, the Black Sea remains a flashpoint. Renewed Russian attacks on civilian vessels and port infrastructure, particularly in Odessa, are once again exacerbating global food security. I am determined to continue my engagement with all concerned to support the freedom and safety of navigation in the Black Sea. Mr. President, the targeted devastation of Ukraine's energy infrastructure may make the coming winter the harshest since the start of the war. It is not difficult to imagine how daily and prolonged power cuts aggravate living conditions, acutely affecting the more than 2 million people whose homes have been damaged or destroyed and those near the front lines. The UN remains fully mobilized to support Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery efforts. This includes critical support to enhance the resilience of the country's energy infrastructure. Our immediate focus is on the winter response plan, but without required resources, the most vulnerable will lack sufficient protection. Unimpeded humanitarian access is essential to reach some 1.5 million people in regions of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation. Those areas remain beyond our reach. At the same time, the operating environment for humanitarian actors has become more dangerous. This year so far, at least 9 humanitarian workers have been killed in the line of duty and more than 35 injured. This is unacceptable. Despite the international community's grave concerns, the risk of nuclear incident remains all too real, as military activities continue to be reported near Europe's largest nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia and other sensitive locations in the conflict zone. The consequences of such an event would be catastrophic and should make us all shudder. It is imperative for all parties to act responsibly to ensure nuclear safety and security. Mr. President, the recent reported deployment of thousands of troops from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the conflict zone and their involvement in the fighting is alarming. This would add fuel to the fire, further escalating and internationalizing this explosive conflict. There is little doubt that this war at the heart of Europe is a conflict with global implications. It undermines regional stability and deepens geopolitical divisions. It must end. Reversing the current dangerous path will require concerted diplomatic efforts and political will. It is high time for a just peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. We stand ready to use our good offices and to make available the tools and experience of the United Nations in full support of all meaningful efforts toward a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom. Thank you, Rosemary, again for your briefing. And thank you again, Andre, for joining us this afternoon. Here in this council, 1,000 days into Putin's full-scale invasion, the UK is keeping the spotlight on Ukraine, not just for the security of the Ukrainian people or just for Europe's security, but for something much more fundamental, which every should care about: the right to be a sovereign, independent country, free to choose its future, protect its borders, and stand up to aggression. Everyone on this council should be familiar from the climate crisis with the concept of tipping points, the critical moment after which changes are irreversible. These exist in geopolitics as they do in science. And unless Putin fails, I believe we face one over Ukraine. Unless Putin fails, we could plunge into a world where the principles enshrined in the UN Charter will have lost their meaning. Unless Putin fails, others will be inspired to wage imperialist wars of conquest. Unless Putin fails, our faith in international law may never return. And unless Putin fails, each of our borders will be less safe. If anyone doubted Putin's intent this weekend's massive missile attack on Ukraine and its energy infrastructure should serve as a reminder. Putin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness. For years, the Kremlin has tried to bully Ukraine into submission. Russian missiles have struck hospitals and grain ships destined for Africa. Russian troops have raped and tortured Ukrainian prisoners, and Russian police have abducted Ukrainian children for indoctrination in Russia. Like a desperate gambler, Putin has got all in on this illegal war. Putin has lost so many soldiers, 1,000 days into a war he thought he would win in days. He's now turning to North Korea for reinforcements and to Iran for ballistic missiles. These actions must be met with a firm response, and that's why today I can announce fresh sanctions on Iran Air and Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, a direct response to Iran's ballistic missile deliveries to Russia. We are using the full force of our sanctions to constrain the Kremlin's illegal actions, from their shadow fleet of oil tankers to suppliers to their war machine, from shady kleptocrats to mercenaries destabilizing the continent of Africa. And we are stepping up our support to put Putin in a position of strength with a new loan backed by profits from sanctioned Russian assets, part of a new G7 package of $50 billion in assistance, and a commitment to £3 billion in military aid for as long as it takes. Let me be crystal clear. There is no equivalence, no comparison, no parallel between those reckless states who support Russia's illegal aggression and those who stand with Ukraine in defense of its sovereignty. Council, the Kremlin wants to plunge Ukraine into darkness, but we must stand for the light of its freedom. Ukraine and its partners want peace in line with the UN Charter that brings us together today. But we know that Putin only responds to strength. To have a lasting peace, lasting security, we've got to stand as strong, as united, as patient, as determined as the Ukrainian people. And so I say that my message to Vladimir Putin is simple. We will never let up on countering Russian aggression at every turn. 1,000 days in, we stand for Ukraine. 1,000 days in, we still stand for international order. 1,000 days in, we still stand for the principles which the United Nations was founded upon. And 1,000 days in, we're ready to face down your aggression as the day you started this senseless war. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Under Secretary-General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. And I would also like to welcome our Ukrainian colleague, Foreign Affairs Minister Andriy Sybiha. As we mark the 1,000th day of this war, words fail us in the face of the suffering in your country. Through you, my dear colleague, I extend my thoughts to the Ukrainian people. Over the last 1,000 days, more than 10,000 civilians have been killed and more than 20,000 wounded, not to mention the immense losses among the soldiers. Behind these soulless figures are men, women, and children. What a tragedy. We are deeply concerned about the massive attacks on energy infrastructure in recent days. This is a grave danger to the civilian population as winter approaches. Switzerland calls again and again for the respect of international law, in particular, respect for international humanitarian law. Excellencies, dear colleagues, for 1,000 days now, all these calls for peace have gone unanswered. This war has become a major source of international destabilization of international security, with the nuclear threat, destabilization of food security and energy supplies, destabilization of respect for fundamental rights, and finally, destabilization of multilateralism. The risk of this war expanding is alarming. I'm referring here to reports of the military presence of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in Russia. These latest developments on the battlefield highlight the unsustainability of this war for us all. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for Russia to end its war against Ukraine, launched in violation of the UN Charter. After 1,000 days of war, the guns must fall silent. It is time to find a diplomatic solution. Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders must be respected. 5 months ago, we gathered in Switzerland, in Birkenstock, to talk for the first time at the highest level about peace in Ukraine. Since then, we have continued these efforts relentlessly, and we will continue to do so until such time as a diplomatic solution is found. Mr. President, making peace takes courage, as I reminded this Council last September. Making peace also requires energy. the energy to pursue the diplomatic path despite fatigue and despite frustration, particularly for those men and women on the ground facing the prospect of a third winter of war. The courage to involve all parties in this dialogue, including Russia. The energy to call again and again for the application of the UN Charter, as well as respect for the Geneva Conventions and the energy to live up to our humanity. Switzerland will support all peace initiatives and efforts that are based on the principles of the UN Charter. Aware of the lessons of our shared history, we are ready to assume our responsibilities. For the Ukrainian people, certainly, but also for our European continent and for the entire world. We all aspire, each and every one of us, to peace and stability. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cassis, for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you very much, Foreign Minister Lamy, for bringing us together and chairing this important meeting. I thank Undersecretary-General DiCarlo for sharing the Secretary-General's statement and sobering briefing. I welcome the participation of Ukraine's Foreign Minister in this meeting today. 1,000 days ago, February 24th, 2022, Russia launched its brutal and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. President Putin believed it would be a quick victory. Ukrainians would succumb, wave the white flag of defeat, and yet the Russian military failed to conquer Ukraine in its existence as an independent country or absorb it into Russia. When he couldn't break the Ukrainian military, Putin ramped up efforts to break the Ukrainian people, killing tens of thousands of Ukrainian men, women, and children, uprooting millions of families from their homes, bombing out thousands of schools and hospitals, energy infrastructure and food storage, abducting thousands of Ukrainian children and relocating them into Russia. And yet, for 1,000 days, the people of Ukraine have not broken or bent. But while today is an important marker, there's nothing special about this somber occasion. Winter is approaching, and Russia's relentless attacks have devastated critical infrastructure, leaving millions of homes without light, heat, and water. Russia's seizure and militarization of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant puts all of Europe on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. Every day, Ukrainian families live in fear. $147,000 of them. And every night, Ukrainian families live in fear. Russia has no regard for Russian life. You saw Russia just this morning veto a resolution on Sudan that would have facilitated humanitarian assistance. You heard them declare their support for the Palestinian people. But you, as I know this is just hypocrisy at its best and lies that they are concerned at the worst. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have died fighting this cruel and callous war. And 1,000 days since it began, the carnage has only accelerated. Russia is absorbing more than 1,200 casualties a day. more than at any other time during the war. And so, in its desperation, the Kremlin has turned to the DPRK, first for arms and now for manpower. At least 10,000 soldiers, sent first to Eastern Russia and now to the far western Kursk oblasts bordering Ukraine, have begun engaging in combat operations with Russian forces. It is a move without modern precedent. Not in over 100 years has Russia welcomed foreign troops onto its soil. Flagrantly violating Security Council Resolution 2231. All the while, Russia has disregarded its chemical weapons convention obligations and stated publicly it will supply captured weapons to non-state actors, including state sponsors of terrorism. Colleagues, these are the actions of a rogue state. And so rather than try and justify the unjustifiable, Russia simply lies. Days ago, Russia's representative told us to our face there would be no invasion. As the world watched live broadcasts of Russian forces and tanks crossing into Ukrainian territory and Russian missiles raining down on Kyiv, he continued to insist in this council there was nothing to see here. The lies continued. We were told that no North Koreans were deploying through Russia. Now North Koreans are fighting on Russia's front lines under the command of the Russian military. All the while, this chamber has been flooded with slurs and baseless accusations against Ukraine's democratically elected leaders, along with specious arguments about how Ukraine's sovereign right to choose its own path, so-called legitimate interests or legitimate security concerns. Of course, the UN Charter is very clear. No country, quote unquote, security concerns, legitimate or otherwise, give it the right to dictate another country's policies, let alone invade and annex another country's territory. All of this comes down to the fact that Putin has simply never accepted that Ukraine, a fellow UN member state, has the same rights to sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. Indeed, he has gone on the record multiple times saying, quote, Ukraine is not even a state, unquote. Perhaps it's why Putin so underestimated the resolve of the Ukrainian people, how bravely and effectively they have been able to defend their homeland, their democratically elected government, their culture and way of life for 1,000 days. As Ukrainians continue the fight against imperialist invasion and might makes right ideology, the United States stands with them. And let me be clear, when this war ends, a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine will be in control of its internationally recognized territory and continue on the path to joining Euro-Atlantic. And at the direction of the president, the United States will continue to surge security assistance to armored vehicles and other needed capabilities and munitions. And we will announce additional security assistance for Ukraine in the days to come. Because ultimately, supporting Ukraine in Congress and beyond it cannot be and should not be a partisan issue. Standing up for democracy and human rights is above petty politics and outlasts any one leader or term. We would love nothing more than to see the people of Ukraine experience the safety and security they so deserve. But a peace that is not just is not peace. A peace that is not sustainable is not peace. And a peace that is not Ukraine-led is not a true peace. And so I call on all UN member states to support Ukraine's formula for a just and lasting peace, one that fully respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and holds Russia to account for its crimes and violations of the UN Charter. I again call on another permanent member of this council, China, to stop stoking war on the European continent, enabling Russia's war effort, to cease providing dual-use goods to Russia, and to quit parroting Russian talking points to justify this war, because there is no justification. Most of all, I call on Russia to end its aggression against Ukraine and now. In the support to countries like Iran and the DPRK, support that foments instability, not only in Europe, but everywhere from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific, in the assault on food security around the world, and especially in the Sahel, where millions of hungry people rely on the Black Sea Grain Initiative for sustenance, and in the needless suffering of Ukrainian and Russian people who have endured Thank you, Mr. President.
Excellency, Mr. Thomas Greenfield, for an excellent statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Fuji Kisayuku, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Secretary Lamy for organizing this meeting. I would also like to thank USG DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing. It has been 1,000 days since Russia began its aggression against the sovereign nation of Ukraine. To the people of who have been defending their country for these 1,000 days, we express our deepest respect and unwavering solidarity. Last Saturday, Minister for Foreign Affairs Iwaya visited Ukraine and directly expressed to Minister Shibiha Japan's intention to cooperate with Ukraine to achieve a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, and stated that our steadfast commitment to stand with Ukraine remained unchanged. Mr. President, we are appalled by the massive and widespread missile barrage on Ukraine over the past week, which caused the casualties of innocent civilians. We will continue to condemn in the strongest terms Russia's illegal aggression, which has critical civilian infrastructure. We repeat, Russia must immediately cease this aggression, withdraw from Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, Russia continues its aggression against Ukraine. With not only its own arsenal, but also weapons supplied by North Korea, violating the resolutions Russia had itself agreed upon. There is clear evidence, and subterfuge should never be tolerated in this chamber. The situation now enters another dimension as North Korea's soldiers have been dispatched to Russia and they are now engaged in combat against Ukraine. Such involvement in Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine constitutes a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter. North Korea's direct support for Russia in this regard has serious potential consequences for European and Indo-Pacific peace and security. Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. We condemn in the strongest term this unlawful, unjustified, and unacceptable military cooperation between. We also reiterate our deep concern about military cooperation between Iran and Russia. The international community must refrain from supporting Russia's aggression directly or indirectly. Mr. President, the importance of diplomacy and dialogue for peace is indisputable. However, it should be crystal clear that Ukraine is not the one who is waging this war. Ukraine was forced to fight to defend itself. It is Russia that launched an unprovoked war of aggression. Once Russia stops its aggression and withdraws to the internationally recognized border, it will end immediately. What is needed now is not a call for peace that ignores Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, nor a demand for both sides to be escalate in an equal manner, which only rewards the aggressor. The question is whether to uphold or disregard the principles of the UN Charter. It cannot be clearer who violates the Charter. We must uphold the international order based on the rule of law and never tolerate violation of international law. Japan will continue its diplomatic efforts together with Ukraine and the international community to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. Mr. President, Japan is committed to and will continue its long-term efforts to rebuild the lives of the Ukrainian people and the entire country. We have already pledged over $12 billion in support of Ukraine in the areas of humanitarian assistance, recovery, reconstruction, and finance, which are steadily being implemented. We will continue to provide support, including in the areas of energy supplies and landmine removal. To conclude, Mr. President, we emphasize that any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force is unacceptable anywhere in the world. Japan stands firmly with Ukraine until peace and justice prevail. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Fuji for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Marko Stucin, Deputy Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Minister, for organizing this briefing. I would also like to thank Under Secretary-General DiCarlo, delivering. I'd like to warmly welcome Ukrainian Foreign Minister Sybiha at this meeting. Tomorrow will mark 1,000 days of war in Ukraine, 1,000 days of death, destruction, and displacement, but also 1,000 days of inaction of this very council. I have just returned from Kiev, and while being humbled by Ukraine's perseverance and determination, I'm also deeply disturbed by the dire situation that the civilian population is facing as the country enters the third winter of this war of aggression. Just in terms of the toll on human lives, these 1,000 days have been catastrophic. Last week, I have also visited Bucha, one of many sites where mass graves were found in the first months of the war in Ukraine. In just one of them, 508 Ukrainians are buried, and the bloodshed continues. It is estimated that in the first half of this year, 3 times as many people died in Ukraine as there were born. The number of civilian casualties is at its highest in the last 2 years. This gloomy picture is only about to get worse as Ukrainians brace themselves for the winter. Just yesterday, Russia launched its largest aerial attack on Ukraine in months, hitting energy infrastructure across the country with more than 200 drones and missiles. Continuous deliberate attacks against energy infrastructure are not just military tactics. They are, first and foremost, attacks on civilians, taking away their lives, cutting off their heating, breaking their spirits. These attacks are a despicable violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, for 1,000 days we have been discussing the casualties of the war, and each time our deliberations were followed by silence and impunity. With each day of inaction by this council, the integrity of international law, including the Charter, was diminished. A lot is at stake with this war. It is more important than ever that the Council members condemn aggression, that we demand respect for international humanitarian and human rights law, and that we make it clear to the perpetrators of war crimes that they will not get away with it and will be held accountable. A single day of war is one too many. There are no words to describe how tormenting 1,000 days of war are. We need a just and lasting peace as soon as possible. A peace that would not come at the expense of the fundamentals of international law, a peace that will be based on UN Charter and its key principles, safeguarding Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine, as the country under attack, must of course agree with any such peace plan. This is the only way to stop this war, and this war must stop. Until then, Slovenia will support Ukraine every step of the way. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Susin for his statement.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for her valuable briefing. We are holding today's meeting as the situation in Ukraine continues to be a cause for grave concern, where the war continues to claim the lives of innocent civilians. It has displaced a large number of civilians who are now in search for a safe refuge. This clash between Ukraine and Russia has led to a humanitarian tragedy. This protracted war has caused and continues to cause considerable material damage and massive destruction of infrastructure. It is truly because we have almost grown accustomed to this inevitable situation, given the absence of any change in the situation on the ground, despite the many individual and international initiatives to bring positions and points of view together. The parties concerned have chosen the logic of escalation and confrontation and polarization, but this logic will not lead to an end to this tense situation, and Algeria has already warned of this on many occasions. My country continues to call for additional efforts to give precedence to dialogue over confrontation and war, because we believe that a solution can only be achieved through a peaceful dialogue. And this dialogue must be based on three essential points. First, the need to put an end to the hostilities and to protect civilians. Second, compliance with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and the rules of international law, and we all agree on the supremacy and just character of these rules. Third, addressing the root causes of the conflict and taking into account the security concerns of all parties. Mr. President, it is necessary to work together to guarantee a permanent solution for this conflict. And the repercussions of this conflict are no longer limited to the region. It has expanded and now impacts the entire world, particularly developing countries. Therefore, Algeria remains ready to participate in a constructive manner in efforts to create a solid ground to facilitate dialogue among parties in order to strengthen consultations at all levels and with all parties, and to support efforts to strengthen a permanent and just peace. Algeria remains ready to provide the necessary support to give precedence to the language of peace and security in the region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for our briefing. I welcome the participation of the ministers in this meeting, including His Excellency Mr. Andres Sibia, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, in this meeting. Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned about the escalating security and the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which has persisted for 1,000 days. The conflict has escalated drastically, and the battlefield has expanded with intensified offensive operations by both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. With almost 2 years and 9 months of brutal conflict, Sierra Leone regrettably takes note of recent escalatory conducts of intensive large-scale drone attacks on Ukraine, and news reports that restrictions on the use of long-range missiles to strike targets inside Russian territory have been lifted. This follows recent intelligence and open source report that troops of the People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, are now engaged in combat in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation. The reports, if confirmed, mark a dangerous escalation of the conflict and have the potential to dramatically increase in scope with severe attendant risk and broader destabilizing impacts on regional and international peace and security. The inability of the Security Council to act further puts at risk its credibility and dependability to maintain and also address threats to international peace and security. Colleagues, given the regrettable, devastating impact of the conflict, let us remind ourselves of the worrying trend of civilian casualties for just the past 4 months. From the Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine reports of 9 August 2024, Sierra Leone notes an alarming increase in civilian casualties since March this year, with July being the deadliest month with at least 219 civilians killed and 1,018 injured. Particularly in Ukraine for August, we are similarly alarming, with at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured. According to OCHA and OHCHR reports, intensified hostilities and attacks in September 2024 led to another alarming civilian casualty numbers, with at least 208 killed and 1,220 injured. We take note of reports from Ukraine of multiple attacks in October, targeting civilians and vital infrastructure, such as residential areas, markets, railways, and grain storage facilities, using guided area bombs, strike drones, and missiles. Additionally, the attacks have reportedly continued to target and damage numerous civilian facilities across Ukraine, including electricity and gas facilities, despite in winter. We note that to address the winter-specific needs, the humanitarian community launched the 2024 to 2025 Winter Response Plan, appealing for $492.1 million to support 1.8 million people with critical winter-related humanitarian assistance as outlined in the 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This plan intends to support timely preparedness and response. Sierra Leone calls on the international community to support this plan. We have reiterated in this council that the deliberate targeting of residential or civilian areas, civilian infrastructure, and essential services such as hospitals, schools, water and energy facilities are unacceptable and prohibited under international law. It poses a significant threat to the safety and well-being of the most vulnerable and protected populations, violating the basic tenets of humanity and the principles of international humanitarian law. Sierra Leone deplores attacks on civilians, vital civilian infrastructure, and protected objects. We call on all involved parties to take all necessary measures to avoid further civilian casualties and damage to critical infrastructure. Mr. President, in addition to the mounting humanitarian challenges, OCHA has further indicated that humanitarian response efforts face growing challenges, including safety risks. 6 aid workers were killed or injured in July and August alone. It noted that in the first 9 months of 2024, the humanitarian community had provided at least one form of assistance to 7.2 million out of 8.5 million people targeted for support. This is despite the 2024 humanitarian appeal for Ukraine receiving less than half the requested $3.11 billion. Additional resources are critically needed to ensure much needed assistance. The drastic escalation, alarming civilian casualty figures, and the devastating humanitarian consequences of the conflict on civilians, including the elderly, women and children in Ukraine, underscores the urgent need for the violence to end. All parties to the conflict must prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Mr. President, as Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the seeming strategic approach to annexed territories, we take the opportunity to reiterate the UN Secretary-General's instructive statement of 29 September 2022, in which he recalled that any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the UN Constitution 2202, reaffirming its full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In a similar manner, we reaffirm the full respect for the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of the Russian Federation. Let me close by urging all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and critical infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and energy infrastructure, to ensure essential services for the well-being and stability of civilians. Peace is made not between friends, but between parties in a state of disagreement. Therefore, peace should be actively pursued and not be left to chance. Sierra Leone reiterates its call for meaningful steps to be taken towards the immediate cessation of the hostilities and for constructive and inclusive conflict. And take a call for the full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and for the legitimate concerns of all parties to be taken into account in order to find a political and diplomatic solution